Well, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be building on what we've been discussing previously. So again, just broadly speaking, we've been focusing on the I side or personnel side of industrial organizational psychology. We've discussed the importance of a job analysis, that the first thing that we have to do is measure the actual nature of the job itself to truly quantify what knowledge, skills, and abilities are required to do the job, and also what are the specific tasks or goals or basically the main things that the job entails that maps on to what the organization does. So in other words, what are the actual organizational relevant outcomes of that position or that job? And previously we were discussing about the idea of performance appraisal and performance management. In other words, kind of the process of measuring performance and the process of then providing that information back to the person in a way that would result in developmental feedback, but also decision making. We're going to focus much more closely now on simply the idea of actually measuring performance. So what we refer to the measurement of performance when we're just talking about actually capturing the idea of performance is criterion measurement. So the reason we use the word criterion here is that when we're talking performance appraisal and criterion measurement are very similar. Both of them are trying to capture performance. When we're talking about it from a performance appraisal standpoint, we're trying to capture performance for the purposes of actually providing feedback and making decisions. When we're talking about criterion measurement, we're specifically more focused on the statistical measurement of performance for the purposes of comparing that performance to other selection techniques. So in other words, when we're talking about criterion measurement, we're not talking about measuring performance for developmental reasons or decision making. We're talking about measuring performance as a statistical measurement that we are going to use to validate selection techniques. So when we're trying to select employees for a job, we need to know what good performance is. And then we need to be able to relate those measures of good performance to the selection test that we're going to give people prior to them having the job. So the idea of criterion measurement, and the reason we're using criterion now instead of performance measurement, is that we're talking about it when we're actually doing it for the purposes of guiding or providing information about how to make better selection techniques. So the criterion problem here is kind of a theoretical model, and the theoretical model is that it's impossible to point to any one performance criterion and argue that it's a perfect measure of performance. So when we talk about criteria and criterion is an attempt to measure all of performance. Individual criteria are the individual measures of performance. So from the last lectures when we were talking about dimensions of performance, if you found 5 dimensions of performance in a performance appraisal system, each of those dimensions would be considered a criteria, a single measure of a portion of performance. When we talk about criterion, that's the plural effectively, we're talking about all of those combined. So, basically speaking, it's almost impossible to come up with a perfect measure of performance. We're always going to be missing some aspects. So we have to recognize to begin with this is going to be an imperfect process. And that's unfortunate because we're doing this process now not just to capture performance, but to capture performance as a marker for our selection techniques. So performance is the criterion in which most organizations, employees, managers, and IO or psychologists are interested in. So pretty much across the board from the I side, we're very much always interested in performance. We're interested in performance as it relates to organizational goals. We're interested in performance as it relates to informing organizational decision making. We're interested in performance as it informs training and development to increase performance. But we're also interested in performance as a marker of organizational success. And we're interested in performance as a guide to creating better selection techniques to find people that will be good at performing in their jobs. So just some general information about performance, again, usually comprises more than one dimension, can be suitable for different types of decision making, and no one criteria is suitable for all purposes. So again, even when we're starting to create these measures of the criterion, total performance, also different parts of it may be better for different types of decision making. And we saw a little bit about that when we were talking about performance appraisal in the last lecture set. that with performance appraisal, one of the more accurate systems we can use is a 360-degree feedback system. Unfortunately, by the nature of the way we collect that data, it's not very useful for decision-making purposes. And if you try to use it for decision-making purposes, it often weakens the advantages you get with 360. So it's mainly a developmental tool. So defining criteria and their properties. So criteria, an evaluative standard that can be used as a yardstick for measuring the employee's success or failure. So uses include appraising employee performance, training program evaluation, selection validation, layoff and promotion decisions. So again, criteria, the actual measure of performance, individual parts of performance, can be used for different purposes. We can identify weaknesses, we can validate our selection techniques. And again, that idea of validation is the truthfulness. So again, if we're validating a selection tool, that means that we have a test, an interview, a system that we're using to select people for a job. To validate whether that selection is working, we want to find out, is it statistically and mathematically related to our measures of performance? And again, performance is all of the on-the-job behaviors that are relevant to the organizational goals. Also referred to the criterion, performance, and performance criterion. Again, that plural of all of performance. So theoretically, when we're measuring performance, or criterion, the sum total of performance, what we're after is something we refer to as the ultimate criterion. It encompasses all aspects of performance that define success on the job, from the very largest component to the very smallest component. So it is, if you could theoretically measure every single factor and weigh it appropriately to what exactly is perfect performance in a job, that would be the ultimate criterion. It's a theoretical construct that we develop as a guide or goal to shoot for in measuring performance success. So the idea is that even when we're trying to theoretically think of what the ultimate criterion is, it's still going to be somewhat error-ridden. So often an ultimate criterion will be created by looking at a job analysis and going, what did the job analysis find as far as the tasks of the job, from the largest and the most important task all the way down to the smallest and most inconsequential task? All of those technically should be measured in some way if we were truly wanting to measure the ultimate criterion. But even then, the job analysis may have missed some components of the job. So generally speaking, the ultimate criterion is a theoretical goal. We often will try to structure an approximation of it from looking at a job analysis, but even then, we don't know exactly what it is. It's an unknowable criterion. Thorndike in 1949 in this personnel selection book basically suggested the ultimate criterion is very complex and basically is not accessible. That if we're really interested in perfect measure of performance, that we're not going to get there. However, by conceptualizing what we believe perfect measurement of performance would look like, it gives us some very strong tools to decide what we should be measuring to get as close as possible with the resources and time we have. So we can never completely define and measure every aspect of performance, but by thinking about it, we can come up with better measures of performance. So the actual criterion is our best real-world representation of the ultimate criterion. So again, we're trying to capture as much of that ultimate criterion in the actual methods we're going to use to measure performance. And it's the best real-world representation that we can get. And generally, we're striving to make our actual criterion as close to the ultimate criterion as possible. But when it says real-world representation, what that refers to is this isn't just about trying to come up with the very best possible statistical measurement of performance. It's also recognizing the limitations in both time and resources. So the more and more things you decide you should measure to try to capture the ultimate criterion, the more and more time and effort it's going to take to measure those things. And at a certain point, you start to get to where it's kind of a conflict of interest. You're spending so much time trying to measure performance that you're probably going to start impacting negatively performance. So we developed the actual criterion to reflect the overlap with the ultimate criterion as much as possible. And it includes only those elements, the ultimate criteria, that we intend to measure. So basically, it's limited by what we choose we're actually going to try to measure. So our criteria for the criterion. So basically, what makes a good measure of performance? What makes a good criterion, a group of predictors? Bernard and Beatty in 1984 came up with about a little over 25 characteristics for measuring the effectiveness of criteria. We're going to discuss 5 of these characteristics that have been most borne out by research that followed their study and their suggestions, and has also been shown to be used over and over and over again in kind of conceptualizing the measurement of performance in organizations. And that's relevance, reliability, sensitivity, practicality, and fairness. And if you remember our lecture on performance appraisal, you're going to see a very similar theme here. Like I said, we're basically looking at the same problem from a slightly different angle. So relevance. Relevance is about how much that criterion actually overlaps the ultimate criterion. How much of true performance are you capturing? Reliability is, again, that any measure of performance, if we think performance is a stable construct, a stable trait, should be fairly reliable. So if someone's rated as very high in performance one week, we'd expect them to be rated similarly. Maybe not exactly the same. People change briefly from time to time. But if someone's really good at teaching, probably even their worst lecture is still going to be rated fairly highly. If someone's really poor at teaching, probably even their best lecture is still going to be rated somewhat poor. That would be an indication of a reliable measure. Sensitivity. Sensitivity, basically, can it distinguish between high performers, medium performers, and low performers? Practicality, so how much time, effort, and resources does it take to actually use? And finally, fairness. How is it being perceived? So relevance is the one that we most focus on as far as looking at this idea of the ultimate criterion, everything we should measure, and the actual criteria, what we're actually going to measure. It's the degree to which the actual criterion is related to the ultimate criterion. And this, again, is not going to be necessarily measured with any kind of statistics. We're going to be talking about it as if we're looking for a relationship, as if we're trying to gather how much of the ultimate criterion is being accounted for by the actual criterion. But these are basically all just kind of logical thought arguments. We're trying to estimate or systematically guess how well we're doing this. And again, this is often drawing deeply from a job analysis. So it's the degree of correlation or overlap between the actual and ultimate criterion, and we want as much overlap as possible. It's a percentage of variance in the ultimate criterion accounted by the actual criterion. And again, I want to stress, I just use the words correlation, overlap, and variance. We're not actually measuring these. We're estimating them. We're guessing at them. We're basically thinking about what all is in the ultimate criterion and how many of those items did we capture in our actual criterion. So the conditions that limit relevance are a couple. So we're going to see a model of this in a few slides. But the first thing to recognize is criterion deficiency. This occurs when a major source of variance in the ultimate criterion is not in the actual criterion. So what this means is that there was a major portion of performance that was delineated in the job analysis that we think is in the ultimate criterion that we are not capturing in our actual measures of performance. So a big example of a criterion deficiency is if you were measuring performance in a sales rep whose job is to bring in clients and contracts, and that is the major, most important part of their job. And to measure performance, you look at number of telephone calls that they make, you look at overall 1 to 5 ratings of their manager, and then you also take a look at number of absences. Well, all of those might be somewhat related to performance and important to measure, but you just missed probably the most important measure that you can have. How many dollars, what's the total size of the value of the contracts this person brings in every month? That's their job. That would be criterion deficiency. A major portion of the ultimate criteria is not being captured by the actual criterion. So criterion is deficient to the extent that these dimensions are not tapped by our criterion measurement, but are important to the criterion construct. So a lot of times when we're trying to create an actual criterion, we're going to be looking at the ultimate criterion and kind of rank ordering. What are the most important things that we have to make sure we're capturing to at least be reasonably certain we're getting an adequate measure of performance? So we want the criterion deficiency to be as small as possible. We want to capture as much of the ultimate criterion as feasible. So criterion contamination is another problem. So the first one we talked about was deficiency. We're missing something in our actual criterion that we should have had. Criterion contamination is when we have something in our actual criterion that we shouldn't have. So it occurs when a measure of the actual criterion reflects things other than what it should measure according to the ultimate criterion. So this can happen two ways. The most common ways we see criterion contamination is random measurement error. So there's always some measurement error and unreliability. But when we are talking about distributional errors, that would be random measurement error. If we have some people that are always rating people highly, always rating people lowly, if you have those kind of errors occurring, that basically means that the measurement itself has problems. So instead of capturing performance, we're capturing the rater's own errors. And that's a problem. The second one we also discussed when we were talking about rater training error in the last lecture sets, and that's bias. Most prevalent when criterion are judgments made by individuals, and that includes, for example, halo effect, similar to me bias, recency effect, any of these things where events are biasing or basically resulting in an unfair perception by the person giving the ratings. That's also criterion contamination. So let's look at a model of this idea, then all put together. So on the left, we have the ultimate criterion. So that's our list. So anything in the first full circle to the left, including the middle section in darker blue, is the ultimate criterion. So we have, in this case, it looks like we're putting together a list of performance traits, probably from a job analysis, about someone that's working as an office secretary or an administrative assistant. So we have typing speed, typing quality, filing efficiency, written communication, oral communication, creativity, innovation. All of these are there. And then to the right, we have the actual criterion. So the full circle with the light blue and the dark blue is what we're actually measuring. Now, anything that is in both circles in this Venn diagram, so the dark blue, that's relevance. Those are criteria that are in the ultimate criteria. They should be measured, and we're actually measuring them. So typing speed, maybe every 3 months we give the person a typing test, and then we also check to see how much accuracy there is, typing quality. Procedural adherence, the manager gives them a rating every 4 months on how much they're actually adhering to actual procedures. Interaction with clients, we might be sending out a short 3-question survey to any clients they interact with, asking them to rate the interaction. Punctuality, we can actually have their actual sign in and sign out, see how often they're late. Computer skills, there might be a small little test they're given every 4 months on their current knowledge of computer skills that we're measuring. Interaction with coworkers, their coworkers might fill out a small survey about how the interactions are, and also the manager may rate that, the interaction with supervisors. And as far as initiative, again, all of those questionnaires might also have an item about initiative. So those are parts that were identified from the job analysis that are in the ultimate criteria that we have put together some form to measure in the actual criteria. Now, criterion deficiency is we have no measure of how efficient they are at filing. We have no measure of their written and oral communication, and we aren't measuring their creativity. So that's deficiencies. Criterion contamination is that we find that some people rate them highly no matter how good they are, just based on how attractive the person is, how likable they are. Some people may actually be rating them poorly because they're young, or maybe their status in the organization. So if any of that's being captured in the ratings, that's criterion contamination. Those are things that aren't related to performance, but we're still capturing in our measurement of performance. So additional criteria for the criteria, that was all relevance. Just as a reminder, relevance is one of the 5 main things we want to think about. Reliability simply is the measure unreliable. We can't use it to make decisions, so we really want to see that the measure is a reliable measure. And the way we test for that is through statistical methods. So if we're giving out performance appraisals to a large number of employees, we're going to track and look at the relationship between people's ratings on those performance measures from time 1 to time 2 to time 3. If we find there's a strong correlation or relationship to where the high performers typically are rated high, the moderate performers are typically rated moderately, and the low performers are typically rated low, that shows us we have a fairly reliable measure. Sensitivity, the extent to which the criteria distinguish between effective and ineffective performers. So again, we're going to make sure that there isn't any distributional errors, and that the way we're measuring performance does allow us to make distinctions or categorizations of types of employees. Practicality, extent to which the criterion can be and will be used by decision makers. So another thing is if you have a really great performance criteria measure, and the people that are making the decisions are ignoring it, that means it's not practical. Practical also refers to the cost and effort it takes to gather this information on a regular basis. And finally, fairness, extent to which employees perceive the criteria to be just and fair. And as we talked about in the last lecture set on performance appraisal, one of the main factors in fairness is giving the person under evaluation a voice and an appeal in that process. So if they know ahead of time what's being measured, written advanced warning of what performance is being measured. If they're provided an opportunity to be a part of the evaluation or to at least hear about the evaluation. And finally, if there's an appeal process, all of those add to that fairness perception. So this is basically just a breakdown. I'm not going to really go through this again. I've pretty much hit most of these points, but if you're wanting to quickly just kind of review what's relevance, reliability, sensitivity, practicality, and fairness, here's a definition of each one of them and an example of what that would look like in the workplace. So the other major problem with the criterion is that there's two components, so the multiple versus composite criteria. So we know job performance is composed of a multiple criteria, multiple little measures, and generally when we're creating a measure of criterion, total performance, we're going to have multiple items we're measuring. So again, going back to that slide 11, where we saw the Venn diagram, there was about 8 or 9 items that were being captured. So that is a multiple measure of job performance. But beyond that multiple measure of job performance, there's also the idea that at sometimes we simply need a single value. So if we're making organizational decisions, we need to have something that allows us to take those multiple items and create a composite criteria. In other words, a single score so we can decide who is the best performer across all these factors. So going into the next lecture set, we're going to talk about how to actually conceptualize or categorize this issue of what is a multiple criteria and how do we take a multiple criteria and make it into a composite. And we're going to be talking about Campbell's 8-factor model, and it was developed to account for performance variance in every job. So again, it's a model that was intended to try to break down the overall facets of behavior, of performance in organizations, into 8 clear clusters. It was originally drawn from the idea of the DOT, so again, the Dictionary of Occupational Terms. It has been adapted now to match ONET, which is the current kind of job analysis website and database that people can draw on. And there's 3 dimensions that were found to be necessary components of every job. So we're going to talk about all 8, but I really want to focus as we end up on this particular module on the 3 that are key to every job. All jobs require job-specific task proficiency. So no matter what the job is, you have to know how to do the actual tasks that are key to doing the job. You have to demonstrate effort. So just knowing how to do your job is not enough. You also need to actually put the time and effort in to do those tasks. And finally, once you're doing those tasks, you also have to maintain personal discipline. In other words, just putting in effort and just knowing how to do it, if you're always late, if you're not showing up for meetings, if you're not being effectively conscientious, in other words, you're not taking that individual effort and making it long-term effort, that's also a problem. And all 3 of these need to be a measure of any kind of multiple criterion measurement.